everybody. My name is Raymond Friel. I'm head of the law school here at the University of Limerick, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of our first alumni from the University of Limerick, Professor Brigid Laffan, who is now a director of the Robert Schuman Centre. It's great to have you here, and it shows, I think, the strong, enduring links that we try to keep with our alumni as far as practical. And I want to thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
We're here, I think, to sort of talk about Brexit. And one of the things that I find when you start to talk about Brexit now is people tend to throw their eyes to heaven. There tends to be a certain degree of exasperation. And so before maybe we move on to some other aspects, what it might be interesting if we just considered not so much the technical details of Brexit, but the impact it has or potentially has for the future development of the European Union itself. After all, that's what we're part of. We wouldn't worry too much about how the US is going to develop or anything like that. In one sense, for many years, we've sort of looked at the UK as being the holder back that prevents the European Union from closer integration. I suppose I'd love to hear, Brigid, from you, what you think about what the next steps for Europe might be as a consequence of Brexit.
So I think, firstly, it's important to think back to the 24th of June 2016, when EU capitals and Brussels woke up to the fact that a large and significant, important member state was about to leave. And this was an enormous shock and very emotional, because it was a rejection of the club that all these countries were part of. And so it was seen really as very threatening at the beginning. It was seen as something that could almost have a domino effect, that other countries would follow. So I think that explains a lot about how the EU approached Brexit. It approached it from the perspective of, we must protect what we have. That is the institutions, the decision-making, but also the market, the single market, which is a very significant geopolitical asset that the EU has. So the instinct was, we must protect. Also, and this was a surprise, the EU said, and we will be united. Now, those of us who work on the EU know that it is characterized more often than not by disagreement rather than agreement, and certainly unity is not a word one would often associate with the EU. But in fact, the EU has been extraordinarily unified from the 24th of June right up to the 24th of December 2020, when finally, in the final last gasping days of the negotiations, there was a trade and cooperation agreement, the TCA, with the UK. Now, moving from that to the future, the way in which the EU handled Brexit was to say, this is a UK choice. They want to leave our club. They are a third country in the making. So the EU said, yes, if we have issues, challenges and reforms, we will do this a la 27, but not involving the UK. So again, there was almost a bypass. Brexit was bypassed from most EU business and was sent down its own channels. And so I think of course for Ireland, because of our proximity and because of the shared responsibility for the Good Friday Agreement, Brexit looms and will continue to loom very large for us. For the other capitals, I would say Berlin, Paris, The Hague, Copenhagen, Brussels itself. Yes, they will be very cautious and vigilant about it, about the way in which the TCA is implemented and about the future relationship. But it's not the top priority. The top priorities for the EU at the moment are, apart from, they better get the vaccines right and get the economies unfrozen. And then post-recovery, the big issues are climate, digital, and Europe's role in the world. And of course, the EU 27 is very conscious of the shift, the big geopolitical shifts we face with China, great power competition, China, US, and what Europe wants to avoid is to be squeezed. That doesn't mean that the EU or Europe is neutral vis-a-vis China and the US. The United States is a privileged partner. But I think the whole Trump period was quite a shock for the Europeans, because suddenly they could envisage a world in which they couldn't rely on Washington, and therefore you had all of this debate starting about strategic autonomy, that the EU had to become almost more sovereigntist in itself. So I think we're in for a very interesting, and I would regard transformative time over the next 10 years, driven by those big tectonic shifts in the world politics, and the economic shifts, and then also Europe's desire to become more of a player and less of a taker in global politics. So I think we're in for a very interesting time, of which Brexit is only a part.
I think that's absolutely right, Brigid. I mean, I suppose one of the issues is that from an Irish point of view, we tend to concentrate very much on the relation with the UK because it does impact on us, perhaps more significantly than almost any other EU jurisdiction. I wonder, and I thought of this myself, that the European Union's success in dealing with Brexit, as you pointed out, was this issue of the unity amongst the 27, speaking as one. But a lot of that was able to happen because the European Union controls the issue of international trade, essentially. So it has experience in there, it has a legislative basis in there, and it managed effectively to negotiate internally from a very strong base, something that, for example, the UK clearly showed that it could not do before the last election. Parliament itself just could not decide what to do. I wonder to some extent when you're talking about, these tectonic plates shifting, and that's absolutely correct, that the growing threat from China, the difficulties with Russia, and as you say, although they're in a different league, the difficulties that have arisen with the US, which show the potential for the sort of turmoil that can happen even in long-established relationships. I wonder, is a vaccine program a certain element, in fairness, where the European Union needs to consider both the sort of structures, format, and political accountability that might be necessary if the European Union is to move forward in a more united front? And there's an argument that, Brexit, as you say, was a very eye-opening event for people in Europe, and the fear was there. The fear, I think, is gone. People don't consider that very many states are now going to leave. I think it was an irrational fear in any event, but it's gone. And so there's maybe an opportunity, and in some senses, if you think about, was it yesterday or today, Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank made the point that the US was very quickly able to work its stimulus packages and so on like that and respond to it, whereas obviously the European Union is slightly slower. And that this may well be an opportunity for the European Union to reform itself in terms of seeing that we go forward, again, without that sort of natural instinct that the UK supplied of being somewhat cautious in further integration. I don't know what you think about that.
So I have no doubt that if Europe, a la the 27, but also all the associated states, if Europe is to seriously tackle climate, that will require an increase in public power wherever that power is exercised, either collectively at the EU level or member states or regionally or in cities. So I think we're moving into a very different phase. The EU, as you said, is a trade giant. It's also a regulatory giant. It really has very strong levers when it comes to regulation. I think the future requires that, both for EMU, but also beyond, requires a strengthening on the fiscal side. In other words, because if you think about climate, the private sector can be a partner in climate mitigation, but can't drive it. It's got to have public power, and it's got to have, in my view, probably fiscal incentives. So one has to think about the EU having a larger budget over the next cycle. Now, in response to COVID, last July, the member states agreed to the Recovery and Resilience Fund, the RRF, which was unimaginable, even in January 20. So, and they also agreed to the common debt issuance, which again was unimaginable. And I don't think that's a one-off. I think we're now going into a much more, what I would call positive integration, which demands more of the member states, but also demands more in terms of accountability and in terms of the democratic fabric of the EU. So what the EU, European Council leaders have always shown a capacity for is that either the euro crisis or Brexit or COVID, when it comes to the cliff edge, they can do things. They did the RRF. What they find much more difficult is taking the long-sighted decisions before they're absolutely necessary. And there, I think, I see the politics of the next decade. One important strand of it will be, how do you create European public goods, of which climate mitigation is one, in ways that the member states will buy into, and in ways that you won't have, for example, one tiny country holding out on something that really matters. Mm-hmm. So I think we will have to see reform on decision-making. We'll have to see reform in terms of unanimity on areas of decision-making that are not absolutely crucial to the member states. And for example, I think there should be unanimity on treaty change, mm-hmm. because it's part of the constitution of a country now. But on lots and lots of other areas, you've got to break unanimity. And I think for one of the examples is the EU was delayed in sanctioning Russia because Cyprus vetoed. So that's, for me, fundamentally undemocratic. So I think that in sensitive areas, you can have supermajorities or unanimity -1 or -2, but it's certainly decision-making. In terms of how to balance the democratic demands of both the national and the European, that's more difficult because national elections remain the political events in the democratic life of the member states. And the European Parliament elections do not give the same level or depth of legitimacy. I've always felt that with the Parliament, it's now a co-legislature, that the Parliament has to have some tax-raising powers before it becomes a serious Parliament, because then it has to take responsibility. Whereas when its powers are predominantly legislative, then in a way there's an imbalance in terms of responsibility. So again, I think that even to repay the common debt, I think there will have to be a change in own resources with some level of EU taxation. I don't envisage the EU emerging from this as a classical federation with very strong central powers. The EU centrally is always going to be thinner, much thinner in identity terms, in fiscal terms, than a nation state. But that doesn't mean that there won't be more Europe over the next 10 years. I suspect there will be.
I think it's very insightful, and I particularly like the point that you made about one of the hallmarks of European decision-making has been the sort of crisis culture that you wait until the last minute. And I think to some extent, you know, and there are going to be two parts to what I'm going to say here now, one of which is we might want to consider to what extent the lack of a belief in a crisis with respect to the United Kingdom meant that there might not have been sufficient movement that might have changed the course of that referendum, that because it wasn't in the traditional you know, Parliament or European buildings, you know, late at night with heads of state, when it involved something which was much more messy and which people didn't really believe was going to happen, that because there was no crisis, there perhaps may not have been the sufficient response to what David Cameron at the time was looking for. I particularly like what you're talking about in terms of the common debt issuance, the sort of Hamiltonian moment, similar to the US, where you federalize the debt. That's going to be a very, very tricky line to navigate, to be honest with you. There are very much large differences with respect to fiscal policy and approaches to budget deficits and so on between member states and the European Union. Federalizing that debt would involve significant sacrifices from everybody and also significant loss of control. Do you think that's really reasonable in, say, 30, 40 years? Or will the problem becomes, and I'm not suggesting you're an oracle, neither am I. I'm just trying to pass it on to you. But, you know, kind of one of the issues is that you're right, with a parliament that is not really nuts and bolts, it's a legislative parliament and therefore effectively does not connect with a democratic constituency in the way that a budget raising parliament would do. How do you think that the union should face that challenge? What can it do to try and make people believe it? And I don't mean to harp on the vaccine, but you know, obviously the successes and failures of the current European Union will give rise to either confidence or a lack of confidence in that more Europe that you talked about.
So if I take the two parts, firstly on the UK. So I'm actually working on a book on Brexit at the moment, which means I've been doing a lot of both archival research, but also interviewing with the key players, including those involved in the Cameron settlement. And what was very striking is that the EU interlocutors with Cameron and Ivan Rogers felt they had given the British too much. And they felt they had gone to the absolute upper limit without crossing the integrity of the four freedoms. And that if they had done more on mobility, which is what Cameron wanted, then the EU would be a different EU. So I was very struck by, there was even some relief that Cameron settlement was off the table, which I found surprising. The second thing that they felt about Cameron was that he did not either defend the deal, but more importantly, he didn't defend the EU. He allowed for a referendum that was characterized by a lot of distortion of what the EU was. And then the third thing that those that were closely involved hold against Cameron is that he didn't understand he was losing. And he told Juncker either a week or 2 weeks out that they would win with 60%. So even his political antennae were not so good. And interestingly, the fact that the British had come to the EU when the Eurozone crisis legacy was still there, the migration crisis, and the EU had worked hard to help him. There was, I think, it soured the post-Brexit period to the extent that they felt that really when the chips were down, the UK didn't fight for its membership, the government in London. So, and that I think had an impact on the way in which they approached the divorce, that the divorce was going to be tough. Mm-hmm. So then moving on to the very big issues you raise about the Hamiltonian moment. I don't think it's a Hamiltonian moment, but it is a very significant shift in the budgetary and public finance politics of the EU, because that recovery fund will be repaid to 2056, 58. It's going to be there for a long time. And having done it once and issued debt once, then it can happen again. And of course, it can contribute to capital markets union and creating a safe European asset. So there actually could be functional drivers as well. Now, I don't think we will ever see that European debt will be one big pot. Rather, that the EU will have policy instruments that will help on the margins, and that those tools will have a common debt element. So I see it as an add-on rather than as a substitute for national debt. There's no way that the creditor states would ever take the risk or the burden. But that doesn't mean that the currency union and the EU more widely wouldn't benefit from having more financial heft. So if the EU budget at the moment is grosso modo 1% of GNI in Europe, then you could see it going to maybe 2, 3, 4%, but nothing like the public finance capacity of the member states, which will continue. Because the EU has got to also manage the diversity and heterogeneity in levels of economic wealth and development, but also preferences of the member states. I think that if you try to push the Europe in a uniform direction, it can create, uniformity can create as many problems as too much diversity. So the EU has constantly having to cope with the tension between the whole and the parts.
Sure.
All federal systems do, but it's particularly acute in the EU because of some of these are pretty robust ancient nation states.
Yes, absolutely. No, and I suppose, yeah, that's been very insightful, and I think you pointed out a large number of the difficulties. And I suppose just because I don't want to keep too much of your time here, because it's very good of you to give it to us, but I suppose one issue that kind of strikes me effectively is in leaving the European Union, the United Kingdom to some extent has created the potential for one of its traditional worst historical fears, which is a united continent against it. And so, sometimes you need to be careful what you wish for, in a sense. So, and I suppose one thing that has struck me is that, and you talked about this quite a bit in terms of, kind of a federation, but not in the traditional sense that we would know it, nothing like a Hamiltonian moment and stuff like that. But I wonder, is Europe missing out on something by not having, say, for example, the equivalent of the president of the United States or the president of China and something like that? Is there an argument, and it had been mooted before, if I recollect, for a directly elected president of the Commission, who in that sense would also bring that accountability that you talked about and responsibility? I don't know what you think about that.
So I have always favored the direct election of the Commission president. For the following reasons. It would create a real political contest. It would put a face before the electorates of Europe, and in my view would maintain the institutional balance in equilibrium between the Council and the Parliament. I am not a fan, I must say, of the Spitzenkandidaten. All those in the Parliament that think, oh, this is good for the citizen, I just don't buy it. So I personally have always favoured direct election of the Commission president. The closest I think we will get is that the president would come via transnational lists. That there would be, in addition to the national dimension of European Parliament election, there would be layered on top a pan-European dimension, out of which you get a pan-European public sphere and the Commission president. But I think that even when it comes to democracy and accountability, the EU is certainly democracy. There's no reason why accountability can't be strong, but democracy will always be thinner, I think. And part of the tension is the union, it has this duality at its core, in that it's a union on the one hand of states and a union of peoples. And you've got to maintain the balance between states and peoples in the system. And so I think that the EU will always be distinctive in polity terms. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, even if you look at the identity formation, most Europeans today, a majority, feel both national and European. There are very few who buy European only. Mm-hmm. Most people have a dual. And so it's European and national and European, or national only. And those who carry that dual identity tend to favor the EU more, think the EU is a good thing, whereas those who are national only either see the EU functionally as a good, as something that modernizes states or contributes to their well-being, or a problem. And that's where you get the radical right. The radical right are anything but nation, they're nation first. But if we think about the potential for fragmentation, then if the EU disintegrated, as political systems can, then we would be left with a very fragmented Europe, which really wouldn't benefit any of the states in Europe, because none of them have the scale that either the US has or China. So I think there are very strong functional pressures that on the EU to survive as a union, that the member states have staked so much and have so much to lose. As we see with the British, it's a living experiment that if you leave the market, look what happens. Look at the non-tariff barriers you're creating for your companies. The 72 pages of paperwork that had disappeared with the single market. So I think that either the EU survives or something like it has to be created.
And I think that's really insightful. And I suppose, in just bringing this to a close, to say, and this is a great opportunity for me, because it is really a privilege to be discussing this with an expert like you, and it is really great that you're an alumni of UL as well, to be honest with you, which is great. But I suppose I'm just asking myself a question as you go through this, and I'm just thinking, does Brexit mean for us, in some senses, that we have reached the limit of the size of the European Union? And all the difficulties that you've mentioned, is this where we're at now? Is Brexit the sign of, well, we've come to our natural borders in the way that, say, other jurisdictions have as well? It's not a bad thing necessarily, but I'm just wondering.
I think that the last enlargement of the EU will be to the Western Balkans. And that will be not necessarily it will be for geopolitical reasons and stability. I don't see Turkey becoming a member of the EU, or Belarus, or Ukraine, or Russia for that matter. So I think we're coming very close. Now, the Eastern enlargement has left a very challenging legacy for the EU, and that is that the EU, and I think historically, had no choice. I think the EU had to open to the eastern half of the continent. But what we see in the politics of many countries in the East, and particularly in relation to the rule of law, is very worrying. And you add the Balkans, and these are weak states, weak capacity. So the EU is carrying a lot on its back. Now, is the rule of law challenge episodic, or is it permanent? If it's episodic, it's fine. You can come through it. Mm-hmm. But if it's permanent, then I think that's very dangerous for the EU, because the EU doesn't have the time. Law is part of the glue that keeps the system together. The fact it's a rule-based system, that countries have an obligation to observe the treaties, and by and large do. But when you see Hungary, in my view, does not meet the classical definition of a democracy anymore. And Poland is going in that direction. Now, I'm much more hopeful about Poland, but you see illiberal authoritarian politics also in Bulgaria, the current Prime Minister of Slovenia. So there are real worries. On the other hand, it's not unexpected, given that these countries did not have deep democratic roots. So was it better to bring them into the EU? I think yes. But the cost at this stage is not negligible.
I think that, again, that's very insightful. And I'm glad that we've kind of move towards, it's great because of your background in political science. I'm a lawyer, obviously, and the rule of law is important. And I think that's one of the final issues that I suppose for the European Union, it is to find, in a sense, its purpose. And part of its purpose must be, as you say, to create the rule of law and to create the values that we have so tightly held to during the creation of the Union. And the further expansion has made that difficult for some jurisdictions. And you rightly mentioned, particularly Hungary, I think, which is problematic to a large extent. And so, yes, I see what you're saying, that effectively there may be some movement towards increasing the size of the European Union, but we're looking at more of a settled state sort of concept and really trying to create those shared values and those shared appreciation of the rule of law within our existing borders as much as anything else, because there are certain elements where that's not actually happening. Yep. Yeah, as I say, I mean, I think we've talked really well about this. I congratulate myself as well as you. So, I think I want to thank you very much for contributing to the Alumni Week 21. We're in a very, very unusual situation, and hopefully we won't be in this again. But we have learned, I think, something which is true, I think, both of the European Union and perhaps the United Kingdom after Brexit as well, which is the resilience. If we stick to a shared vision, a common understanding of what we want to achieve, and we work towards those goals, I think we will come over this pandemic, even though we've had some very difficult times. But we have learned new skills. We would never have done this before. We would have been flying back and forth. Yes. And as you mentioned about climate change, perhaps that's not always the best thing that we were doing. So this has given us new skills, and I think that's the one thing that we should take from both Brexit and from the future development of the Union, that there is hope and that we will adapt to these new changing situations. Thank you very much, Professor Laffan.
A pleasure.